have Konrad do a thing called the In Wheel Time Car Clinic. It gives you a little bit more detailed information about certain things about cars, from the rear end, speaking of rear ends, all the way up to the front bumper. And so Konrad and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, and I said, why don't we get more specific about certain engine things? And I brought up piston rings. And I thought that the piston ring thing was very interesting. I ran across a story about the new evolution of piston rings and the material makeup of them, the size of them, the tension stuff, all of the stuff about piston rings and what they do. And it's not just one ring. But this week we're going to talk about pistons, right. And there are all sorts of different types of pistons depending on the usage.
Right. You know, if you kind of go back into the 50s and 60s, compression ratios were, 8, 9 to 1. In the later 60s, might have got up to 10 or 11 to 1. And then we've moved on up into the new cars where you might see as high as 18 to 1 compression. Well, one of the first pistons that were out there used was what was called a flat top piston. Yep. There's nothing on top of this piston. It's basically flat. And in some instances, there may be some valve reliefs in the piston, and that's just to give a little bit of clearance for the valves as they open and close. And they'll cut these little notches in the valve in the top of the piston for that valve relief. This is a very common looking piston out there in the industry. Was a very common looking piston in the industry. And then you know
what year was that? What year?
Probably
60s,
mid 60s.
Yeah.
And then the Hemi. And the hemispherical combustion chamber
changed it all.
We've got valves that are on both sides of the piston.
Ones.
Massive, huge valves. And in this case, I imagine this is probably a top fuel because there's, it's so highly domed and that it's really a high compression and pretty big reliefs cut in the piston.
Yep. When I see on that Konrad, I see multiple slots for multiple rings.
Yeah, that's got four compression,
wow.
3 compression rings and 1 oil ring on it. So that's the Hemi. The next one would be the wedge engine. So you always heard the wedge engine as the Mopar 440s, maybe even the Chevrolet big blocks. So there would be basically a wedge on top of the piston with valve reliefs cut into it. Again, that lift off of the base of the piston is all about increasing the compression ratio, filling up the combustion chamber with metal to raise the compression ratio on the engine.
So you're filling up the volume with something.
With metal.
Right.
Yeah, right. And then again the notched or the notched piston was probably the most popular over time. Well, now they've moved to gasoline direct injected engines, and the gasoline direct injected engine, the piston has a different function where what they want is the fuel injector sprays into that, what I'll call the bathtub, right there in the center of that piston. And what it's trying to do when the injection sprays into there, it's trying to bounce it all back up into, now I'm a Star Trek fan, not a Star Wars fan. So in Star Trek, they'd shoot the photon torpedo, the little ball of energy. So in the GDI engine, they're trying to create a little ball of air-fuel mixture.
Right there at the spark plug.
Right there at the tip of the spark plug, which is a wonderful way to do it. The issue with it is it means all of that outside area gets very hot because it runs very, very lean. And in that, so if you looked at how the injector sprays on top of the piston on a GDI engine, you'll see that the injector sprays into the middle of the piston and it brings that whole air-fuel ratio power ball right to the tip of the spark plug. So when the spark plug ignites, it's got the proper air-fuel ratio, basically to create an explosion that pushes the piston down.
So the piston's coming up with a reservoir of fuel is what it's doing into that injector.
Well, no, it's coming up with a reservoir of air.
Oh, okay.
And then the injector sprays at a very high pressure and really highly atomized.
Right there at the top of the stroke.
Right there at the top of the stroke. And that puts now this is a port fuel injection system, so you can see there the injector's behind the valve. So it sprays in on top of the valve, and then it kind of fills the combustion chamber.
That was a big thing in the 80s.
Right. And port fuel was primarily introduced in the early 80s. And then there was the direct injected engine, and my fault, the yellow injector would drop down underneath the valve, and the direct injected engine would spray directly into the combustion chambers. That's why the compression ratio being so high and the fuel pressures being so high to bring that all in. And the technology is now that what I call the bathtub is all designed to reflect the fuel spray all up to the tip of the spark plug, so they could use less fuel, still get the correct amount of air-fuel mixture at the tip of the spark plug to push the piston down, and that's where the fuel economy benefits come from.
Get the
direct
same
injection.
burn power with less fuel.
With less fuel. But the for every action there's an opposite reaction. The opposite reaction is the area outside of where that fuel is very lean, and when combustion goes lean, it goes hot. So you got to remember, all around that outside of that piston is where the ringlands are. So that's where the problem comes with carbon deposits in the ringlands and ring sticking and blow by. And with blow by, you get gasoline in your oil, which makes your oil more vaporous, so it evaporates faster, as well as gets sucked up through the PCV system.
So
your oil.
Why not make the piston smaller so that you don't have to deal with that heat on the outside? Because you still have the same burn in the middle.
But you lose power because you don't have enough surface.
Right. Well, and one of the other big things they did in the technology of pistons is they have changed the length of the skirt on a piston. So the skirt on a piston is what kept the piston from rocking back and forth. So in one of those pictures, and I forgot to get to it, it showed that they've actually put a polymer pad on the side of the piston to kind of fill in that space, because a piston skirt, when the piston gets hot, grows and gets larger so that the piston fits the cylinder better. Well, there's a lot of engines have what's called a piston slap when they're cold. So this polymer pad is designed to deal with that piston slap, so that
there's no wobble.
There's no wobble.
Gotcha.
And it's kind of like Don and Jeff. They have short skirts as well.
I have to tell you that my dad worked for a company called Waukesha Motor Company. And they developed industrial engines, all sorts of sizes, from a little small 4-cylinder that actually was developed to start great big, huge 12 and 16-cylinder engines that wouldn't even fit in this room. They're so big. And he worked in the laboratory. And in the laboratory, they did all of the testing and found out, the best way to fuel them. Many of them were gasoline-driven. Most of them were diesels. Some of them were natural gas-driven engines. And he was in this laboratory where they actually blew up engines. And then they looked at the damage and what caused it to blow up. Was it the RPM? What couldn't handle the RPM? The most efficient way to get injections into
fuel
each of
into the combustion chamber.
Right, all of that. And all of those were pretty much injected engines back in the day. And I think that they still are. That company has changed hands, and Dresser bought them and moved the factory up to Canada. But at any rate, he worked in the laboratory, and that's what they did.
And I'm sure your dad would enjoy that piece, because I'm sure he saw most of this evolve in his hands as the design of engines changed over time.
So pistons are round. We get that.
Not all.
I was going to say, aren't there some that are oval shaped?
Honda made a racing motorcycle with an oval shaped piston. It was a V4 engine, and
like a kidney bean shape almost.
It ended up being outlawed because it was just too advanced.
Radical.
Yeah, too advanced for everything.
Why would you do that? Save space?
Well, to save space, but also, you talked about the surface area.
Right.
Is what creates the power. So it gave them an opportunity to make more surface area on the piston in a smaller
combustion area
compartment. Right.
There you go.
Yeah, because it's all about size of the engine as well as size of what you're doing inside the engine.
So let me ask you this. So back, 69, 70, 71, we were putting flat tops in. We were trying to get compression ratios up 11, 12 to 1 or something like that. But then when the smog world came in, everything dropped to like 8, 8.5 or something. So, and now it's kind of cycled where it's coming back up. Why did they do that if it's more efficient at the higher compression ratios?
Well, it's more efficient because the fuel delivery systems are more efficient today. Back then, when you were doing that, you were doing a Holly or a Quadrajet, or maybe even a Carter if you were high tech.
No, we had Hollies. That's as far as we got.
It's whatever they can get out of the junkyard.
But, you know, a carburetor spray is not an efficient fuel delivery system. They may work correctly, but they're not an efficient fuel delivery system. So they had to lower the compression ratio to make sure more of it burned efficiently so the catalytic converter could clean it up. Today, they can get a good clean burn because they're spraying much less fuel in to create, remember what I said, that little photon torpedo right there at the tip of the spark plug. So that burns more efficiently, so they can raise the compression ratio and not have to worry about unburned fuel passing through the exhaust, which is the exhaust emissions that the federal government's concerned
Well, I
with.
knew it had something to do with the smog. I mean, that's what everybody said. Oh, it's the smog. Take the smog stuff off. But didn't really understand the reasoning.
They don't even use that technology in air pumps and stuff like that. They
Well,
don't-
and that's what I was just about to say. You got to remember, back in those days, you had an air pump. You actually had a belt-driven pump on the
Belt-driven air
front of
pump,
the
yep.
engine
Exactly.
that pumped oxygenated air into the exhaust manifold, trying to burn off that unburned fuel.
Or dilute it.
Well, no, actually trying to burn it off, trying to light it up and burn it off in the exhaust stream as it was headed for the catalytic converter. And that, and even before catalytic converters, that air pump was part of it. Air injection reaction is what air stood for, because they were just literally trying to keep the burn happening to kind of clean up.
You know, if you
the
stop
crazy.
and think about all of that, how far we've come in such a short period of time.
Right.
You know, some of my favorite car shows are the Restores show, and also, believe it or not, don't laugh at me, Wheeler Dealers, because they deal with some of that stuff, and they buy cars. They just recently bought an old, I don't remember what it was. It was a Triumph or something.
They buy some of the weirdest cars.
They do. The engine was built for leaded fuel, and they would put additives in it without having to do anything to the engine. Well, two of them actually, engines, little 4-cylinder engines that really had no horsepower per se, they wound up with having to convert them, and to convert them really wasn't that big of a deal. You take the head off and you strengthen the valve seats. And that's really all that they needed to do. But it was a valve job on a car, so it was expensive to do because you had to send it to a machine shop to do it.
And you said that burning the fuel in the manifold or in the exhaust system before it got to the catalytic converter, you said technology's way in advance to the today from the air pump. We still have a catalytic converter.
Oh, yeah, we still have a catalytic converter.
The technology on that piece of equipment has increased, but you still have that part.
Yeah, well, you do.
And if you think about it, on the catalytic converter, you have two oxygen sensors.
Right.
You have one before the converter, which
One
is
after, yeah.
an oxygen sensor. Believe me, if they're replacing your oxygen sensor, they may not know what they're doing. An oxygen sensor, all it does is tell the computer how much oxygen's in the exhaust stream. And the purpose of that is efficiently burned fuel, there should be very little oxygen in the exhaust stream. Inefficiently burned fuel, there's going to be a lot of oxygen left in the exhaust stream. So the O2 sensor tells the computer, hey, there's a lot of oxygen, and it's going to adjust the fuel mixture. Or, hey, there's very little oxygen, and it's going to adjust the fuel mixture. So if you get an O2 sensor code, first off, it means the oxygen sensor is working. When the guy at Advanced Auto Parts starts selling you an O2 sensor because you set a PO 130 or 172 code, they're wrong. The O2 sensor is working. That's why it set the code. There's something else wrong with the system. The fuel delivery system tends to be a vacuum leak, or it tends to be an injector that's dripping. Pick one. That's generally where the issue is.
I hate it when my injector drips.
I know it.
I have a
worst.
pill for that.
A little blue one.
Yeah, no, not a blue one. It's a little white one, actually. But at any rate, how about let's talk about crankshafts, and let's talk about flat plane,
Okay, I'll do that for next week.
and let's talk about this
Yeah.
new engine that Chevrolet's got in the Corvette, the Z06 engine.
I think
That's
they call it a cross plane.
cross
And
plane.
I think the reason they call it a cross plane is because I think flat plane is trademarked already by Ford on the Mustang with their flat plane crankshaft.
Well, I'll tell you what, it sounds like a sewing machine going by you.
Oh,
at
yeah,
what,
yeah,
12,000 RPM or something. It's crazy.
Got
And I want to know about that.
definitely
So
a
let's
different
do
sound, yeah.
let's do that.
Okay.
And I don't know whether you need to incorporate camshafts with that.
No,
No.
the flat
Crank-
plane crank.
Yeah, standard crank, a flat plane, and this cross.
Yeah, and really, if you say flat
hibernation.
plane, it just means you ever had a crankshaft down?
Wait. Say next week.
Yeah, next week.
It's all about the look of the crankshaft.
And
We'll
is
show
it
you all of that.
Corvette pace car this year at Indy? And isn't it a hybrid or I can't remember.
I think it's the new Z06.
No, it's the Z06.
Z06, okay.
Yeah, it's bad to the bone. Anyway, thank you very much for that.
Very cool, Conrad.
Yeah, very cool. So next week we'll do crankshafts.
I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah.